The birthday of the Royal Artillery was the 26th of May 1716, when the first two permanent companies of artillery were formed to take the place of the irregular trains of artillery which had existed previously. Other companies were then formed, and in 1722 all were grouped to form the Royal Regiment of Artillery under the command of Albert Borgard, a Dane. Borgard was the greatest artillery expert of his time. He had fought in 18 battles and 24 sieges and died in 1751, still serving at the age of 92. The regiment received its baptism of fire at the siege of Vigo in 1719. In 1742, we took up arms with Austria to keep the French out of the Rhine Delta, which at that time belonged to Austria. And in the following year, two companies of the Royal Artillery, manning 24 of the little 3-pounder guns, were in action at Dettingen, where King George II was the last English sovereign to command his army in battle. In the 7 Years' War, we joined Prussia against the other great powers of Europe. The war began in 1756, when the French invested our garrison at Minorca. The action of this war, in which the artillery gained the greatest distinction, was the Battle of Minden, where, for the first time, the guns were called upon to move during the battle. The French army took up a position near the town of Minden and were attacked by the combined British and German forces. Our infantry advanced resolutely against the enemy, covered by the fire of a battery of guns on each flank. Captain Forbes McBean's brigade of 12-pounder guns was so effective that the enemy's guns on his left flank were completely silenced. Our infantry pushed home their attack, and by 10 o'clock in the morning, the enemy's line broke. At this point, Captain McBean saw his opportunity, limbered up his guns and took them forward at the trot. His bold handling of his brigade of heavies, which he brought into action in a succession of positions at shorter and shorter range, caused such disorder amongst the retiring enemy that 43 of their guns and all their baggage was captured. It was unusual to try to move the clumsy gun carriages of that time at any pace faster than a slow walk, so that the rapidity of movement of the British gunners at Minden marked an important advance in artillery tactics. 2 of the companies present at Minden survive to this day and bear the honour title Minden to commemorate that action. While 3 companies were engaged in the 7 Years' War, 4 other companies were manning 150 guns in the siege of Louisburg on the other side of the world in North America. Its capture in 1758 paved the way for the capture of Quebec a year later. The artillery took a full part in the preliminary bombardment of the defences of Quebec, and to support the final assault, 1 light 6-pounder gun was hauled up to the top of the Heights of Abraham and contributed materially to the success of the attack. Again, 2 of the batteries concerned in these actions bear the honour titles Louisburg and Quebec. Spain declared war on Britain in 1779 while we were still occupied in America, and tried, with French help, to capture Gibraltar. 5 companies of artillery saw the great siege through. There were only 25 officers and 450 NCOs and men to man 452 guns, howitzers and mortars, so the governor, General Elliot, who had himself served in the Royal Artillery, attached infantrymen to help the gunners. For nearly 4 years, Gibraltar was blockaded by land and sea. It eventually became clear that the fortress could not be starved into submission, since, under the protection of the Royal Navy, it could still be supplied by sea. Attacks by land were then prepared, but these were defeated by a sortie which caught the enemy off balance and succeeded in putting many of his guns out of action and destroying his magazines. Then, in 1782, the Spaniards prepared a spectacular sea-borne assault. This was to be made by a squadron of specially designed assault ships. Each carried a heavy armament of guns and was protected by immensely thick walls of timber with inserts of wet sand. The effects of red-hot shot were to be countered by a system of tanks and pipes which could distribute water to any threatened spot. It was boasted that these battering ships were unsinkable and incombustible. The great attack was made on the 13th of September 1782, and a Homeric struggle ensued. All day long the guns of the assaulting ships and those of the defences bellowed at each other over 1,000 yards of water, while great clouds of white powder smoke drifted across the bay. At first the attackers seemed to have the upper hand, but it was a battle in which endurance was all important. At last, towards evening, after hours of killing labour, sponging, loading, running up and laying their nearly red-hot guns, the defenders at last saw black and not white smoke appear round their targets. Then a great explosion showed that the impregnable battering ships were vulnerable after all. One after another they were blown up and sunk. The grand attack had failed, defeated by the guns of the fortress. In 1784, Lieutenant Shrapnel, R.A., invented a new type of shell containing bullets and a bursting charge. First called spherical case, this type of projectile was later known by the name of its inventor as shrapnel shell. It was not used in the field until some time later, but it was an immediate success in the Napoleonic Wars and gave us a considerable advantage over the French. After the destruction of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, the French army was marooned in Egypt. An expedition was planned against it, using a British force landed on the Mediterranean coast, a force from India landing on the shores of the Red Sea, and a Turkish force marching through Syria. The chief difficulties were those of the climate and the desert, but eventually Alexandria was invested and the French force surrendered. Several batteries of the Royal Artillery bear the honour title Sphinx to commemorate their participation in this campaign. In 1808, Spain and Portugal rose in revolt against French domination and called upon Britain for help. Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Portugal with a British force which contained initially 2 companies of artillery, and there followed the Peninsular War. During the 5 years of that campaign, the patience and genius of the British commander transformed a position of weakness and danger into a victorious advance, which drove greatly superior French armies out of the whole of the peninsula. The Royal Artillery was continuously engaged, both in the field and in the many sieges of the campaign. One celebrated action of the Royal Horse Artillery occurred on the 5th of May 1811 at the Battle of Fuentes de Noro. Our army was being pressed back by a stronger French force, and in the resulting melee, 2 guns of Captain Bull's troop, under the command of 2nd Captain Norman Ramsay, became entirely surrounded by a mass of French cavalry. The guns were given up for lost, but what happened is best described in the words of General Napier, the famous historian of the Peninsular Campaign. Suddenly the multitude became violently agitated, an English shout pealed high and clear, the mass was rent asunder, and Norman Ramsay burst forth sword in hand at the head of his battery. His horses, breathing fire, stretched like greyhounds along the plain, the guns bounded behind them like things of no weight, and the mounted gunners followed close, with heads bent low and pointed weapons in desperate career. In the sieges of those times, it was the task of the heavy artillery to make the breaches in the curtain walls of fortresses through which the storming parties would enter. At the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo, 6,700 round shot were fired from 38 heavy guns, while at Badajoz, whose walls were very strong, no less than 14,000 shot were needed to breach the walls from a range of 540 yards. With these important fortresses in his hands, Wellington could then sweep up through Spain. The Battle of Salamanca provides a wonderful illustration of the way in which he made the fullest possible use of his artillery to give support to the other arms in all stages of the battle. Another famous incident took place at the siege of San Sebastian towards the end of the campaign. The walls had been breached and the storming parties had advanced, but they were driven back outside the breaches by murderous small arms fire from the parapets above. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Dixon, commanding the siege artillery, then suggested that the guns should support a renewed assault by firing on the parapets over the heads of the assaulting infantry. This was done, and thanks to this close support, the attack succeeded. Early in 1815, the exiled Emperor Napoleon escaped from Elba and by June was facing the Allied army in northern France with 76,000 men and 270 guns. The Duke of Wellington brought about his final defeat on the 18th of June at Waterloo. 8 troops of horse artillery and 5 field batteries took part, and all contributed magnificently to its success. Bull's troop, armed with 5.5-inch howitzers and firing immediately over the heads of our own troops, enabled the wood of Hougoumont to be cleared during a most critical stage of the battle. And over the whole of the line, the steadfast devotion of the gunners never left the infantry without support during the long series of French attacks. General Foy, one of Napoleon's most distinguished artillery commanders, wrote, "The English gunners are distinguished from other soldiers by their excellent spirit. In action, their handling is skillful, their aim perfect, and their courage supreme."